If you're just joining, welcome to today's presentation on managing chef cookbooks with JFrog Artifactory. Let's go ahead and get started. Julian, why don't you kick us off by telling our audience a bit about our partnership with JFrog?
Great. Thanks very much, Jamie. As Jamie mentioned, I'm a product manager here at Chef, so good morning to everyone, or good afternoon or evening, as the case may be. And we have been working closely with JFrog on a number of different initiatives for a number of months. Many of our customers tell us that they use Artifactory for storing many of their other artifacts that they have within the enterprise, such as Ruby gems, WAR files, or any other kinds of artifacts that they might be using in their regular production infrastructure. And one of the things that we are excited to announce is this joint feature that has made it into the latest version of JFrog Artifactory, which is now you can store your chef cookbooks in Artifactory as well. And so I'd like to turn it over to Baruch, who will talk to you about that initiative and how you can go about doing that.
Thank you, Julian. Hello, everybody. Yeah, so my name is Baruch. I'm developer advocate with JFrog. As you can see, we have matching hats here with Julian. That was an effort towards this webinar, part of our partnership. I think it's in agreement that we both have to wear our hats now. I'm very excited to be here and talk about chef integration with Artifactory, because this is something we've been waiting for a long time to happen, and we get this requirement from or demand from a lot of our users and customers. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Artifactory and why it is important to support as many technologies as possible, including infrastructure as code tools like Chef. So let's talk about that. That's the agenda for today. We're going to do a brief review of what Artifactory is. We're going to talk about how repositories are used when we are talking about Chef and Artifactory, why it's a good idea to have an in-house supermarket, an in-house repository, why it's a good idea to have it with other solutions. We'll do a demo, and then we will have plenty of time for Q&A. That's the plan. So let's start with something that all of you should be familiar with for a very long time now, and that's continuous integration and continuous delivery pipelines. What you see here is a great illustration from one of my favorite books on the subject, which is called Agile ILM by Michael Huterman. It's a relatively old book, and that's kind of what I like about it, because those concepts are very mature and we actually do them for years. You can see here how a pipeline implemented for software delivery, and you can see that there are different environments from which one after one your artifact, your binary artifact is being promoted through what is called the quality gates. And again, as I mentioned, I really don't think that those are news for everybody, and that's a good thing about it. And just to show you another view of the same process, I will go through an experience of a product build going all the way through from the development team all the way to production through different environments. So it all starts with the developers writing some code, and they use different kinds of build tools and technologies for that. And you can think about developers that write code in Java and use tools like Maven and Gradle and Ivy, or in .NET working with NuGet, Ruby, Python, NPM, whatever you think about, and they configure their software using those dependency management and package management and configuration tools, but also in today's world, the hardware is software as well. And with all the infrastructure as a code movement, which of course Chef is the leader in this market, we configure our infrastructure and our hardware in code itself. So the development team, which is actually now DevOps team, can also write code which is an infrastructure code and then use tools like Chef or maybe Docker to configure their environment. After this is done, they of course will run a local build on their machine to verify that everything works, and this build will require dependencies and artifacts from remote repositories. So if you think about, again, application side of the house, think about maybe Java Maven build that requires a new dependencies as jar files from a repository, or an NPM packages that are required to run a certain JavaScript code. And if we are talking about infrastructure as code, then of course, in our example for Chef, it will be cookbooks or dependencies for cookbooks that are required from the repository. And all those will be retrieved from a local repository. Think about maybe local registry, local supermarket in Chef terms. And if they won't be found, then your repository manager, such as Artifactory, will try to fetch them from remote repositories. And those remote repositories are, of course, something like Maven Central or JCenter for Java, NPM registry for NPM, or of course Chef marketplace for Chef cookbooks. And it will cache it inside your artifact repository, inside Artifactory, and then of course the build or the dependency resolution will be successful. Once that's done, next step is of course committing all the source code, the new configuration files, new dependencies into source control, after which the CI server usually kicks in. And it can be any type of CI server, Jenkins of course, TeamCity Bamboo, or one of the cloud ones, Circle CI, Drone.io, Shippable, Circles, whatever you work with. And this CI server does exactly what the developer just did on their local machine. So they use the exactly same dependency managers, exactly the same package managers and build tools to configure and the same environment and actually rerun the same build on the CI server now. The difference is that the CI server actually also produces something. It can produce the outcomes of your build, which are your software. So again, if we are looking at the application side of the house, it will be maybe a WAR file if you build with Java that actually runs inside Tomcat on some production server, or just an archive with a bunch of artifacts that should be downloaded by a client and run on their machine. Whatever type of artifact is being built, it is then created by the CI server and deployed back to the repository manager, back to Artifactory in our example. Along with this file that is our application, a lot of information is deployed as well. This is what we call the build info. Bill of material, and that's all the information that we gather through the build itself, like environment variables in your CI server, the dependencies that were used, and tons of additional information that is downloaded. The next step will be starting to pass this build through those security gates that we spoke about earlier. So, quality gates. So, different quality tools, like it might be Selenium for the UI tests, or Cucumber for behavioral tests, JMeter or Gatling for stress tests, or manual QA. All those contribute additional metadata about the quality of those artifacts. And as those artifacts being being advanced through those quality gates that we spoke about, they get installed in different environments and provisions on different environments until they are closer and closer to production. And next step will be actually deploying those artifacts onto different environments. And here again, the provisioning tools, like Chef, of course, work with the artifact that we produced previously in Artifactory and deployed those artifacts to different environments. To do that, they need to provision those environments again, and this actually is kind of a meta process that also will use the same artifacts in this artifact repository, like the Chef Cookbooks, in order to do that. And in case we have not a deployable software, not the software that we put on our own servers, but distributable software, software that our customers or the endpoints, whatever they are, people, machines, IoT devices, need to consume and download, then we will use a distribution platform, something like JFrog Bintray, to distribute the software from it. But that's not our case of today. Today we're talking about deployable software, software that is deployed to our servers. So that's the big picture, and again, I really hope that I didn't tell anything new to you in the last 5 minutes, because this is something that we do for years, and it's been successfully implemented in any software development company. And the interesting part here is how Chef cookbooks and Chef recipes, which are not exactly the production artifacts, fit into this picture with all the production artifacts like jar files and npm files or NuGet packages, etc., etc. And why it is important for them to be on the same platform in the same artifact repository. And the answer would be the metadata. When you work with multiple technologies that work together to create one product, it is extremely important that the metadata about all those artifacts will be shared across those different aspects of your application. And taking again this example of a Word file which need to run in a certain Tomcat servlet container, you can think about various requirements that need to come into play in order to this application to be provisioned correctly. It might be the exact version of Tomcat, for example, that need to be set up on the production servers. Where do you express which version of your application works with which version of the cookbook or the recipe that sets up this Tomcat that work with correct database and maybe with correct schema on the database, etc., etc. This linkage between your application and your code that sets up your infrastructure have to be somewhere. And of course, there are a lot of ways to implement it. You can do it using maybe file names that you can specify some kind of metadata in the file name itself. That is not very convenient, and actually you will run into the obvious limitations on how long the file name, reasonable file name can be, but it can be done. You can maybe package inside the archive some kind of metadata files that then can be extracted and observed, but of course it's much easier when your artifact repository provides you with this linkage between different package types. When you can specify metadata that relates a certain cookbook of how to install the application to the application file itself. And when you have a cookbook that needs to take a file from Artifactory, wouldn't be lovely if this cookbook can rely on this metadata to get those files. And then we have a query language that allows you to query those artifacts and get the list of the artifacts that specify that answer this specification exactly. And then you can bake those query language, those queries in this query language into your recipes in your cookbooks and rely on the fact that your recipes will download the right artifacts from Artifactory based on this shared metadata between the artifacts and the recipes. So I hope that makes sense, and if you have any additional questions about this metadata and the importance of having this universal solution, please go ahead and use the Q&A panel now to ask them. We will get to all the questions that you have, and I already see some wonderful questions here towards the end of the webinar. So now let's talk a little bit about Chef Supermarket. And that's, of course, the central repository for cookbooks that we use. And it's wonderful to have it out there because there is a lot of open source wisdom already being baked into those cookbooks, and you can find whatever cookbooks that were previously written. So, for example, if you search for Artifactory in Chef Supermarket, you will be able to find a decent number of different cookbooks that you can install Artifactory with. That's just my experience, what I try to find, and of course there are many others. But wouldn't it be lovely to have your own version of Supermarket running on your machine? And there is a lot of good reasons to do that. Stability, you know, the internet nowadays is much more stable than it used to be 10 years ago, but still it makes sense to have your cookbooks set up on your internal network and not relying on the internet connection going to the Chef Supermarket. And I don't imply here anything regarding the stability of the supermarket service by itself, but it's always good to have a backup and have all the cookbooks cached. Control, you want to veto, to review, to whitelist, to blacklist the cookbooks that your organization can use, for example, and that's very easy to implement when you have your own cache of the cookbooks from the global supermarket. You can review them and decide whether you want to allow some of them used inside your organization or not. And the third scenario is, of course, publishing your own cookbooks. If there are cookbooks which are private to your organization, you might prefer not to share them with the world and not to publish them into the global Chef Supermarket, but instead having your own supermarket in-house and use that. So there are different solutions on how can you run your own private supermarket, and here's an entry in the Chef blog by Neil on how to do it. It's rather lengthy. You know what? Let me show it to you live. Here it is. Just let me turn on the share right here. Okay, now we can see it, and it's rather straightforward, but it's kind of not a very intuitive process. There is a lot of stuff that you need to do. You need to run your own Chef server in your organization, and then you need to set up a bunch of different cookbooks that will do the job. Right, and it's kind of a tedious process with a lot of places to make mistakes and a lot of single points of failure here. Eventually, of course, I'm sure that it's more than possible to use, but it's kind of a hard thing to do. So here you go. As I mentioned, not a rocket science, but also not exactly the most simple thing to do, and not exactly a one-click process. So instead, you can use Artifactory to implement multiple chef supermarkets out of the box. So Artifactory is much easier to install. There are, as I mentioned, a couple of actually chef supermarket cookbooks that allow you to install Artifactory, or you can use any of half a dozen different ways to install it, as a Linux server, as a brew with homebrew in Mac, a Docker image, or you can even have a service running on our servers, and then you just consume it without even installing anything. And once you did that, once you have Artifactory up and running, it's very easy to set up different supermarkets inside Artifactory. A remote repository, what we have a repository is a kind of analogous to the supermarket in chef terms. So a remote repository proxies remote supermarkets like the default supermarket.chef.io, and a local repository you will use to store private cookbooks. And we're going to do both of them just in a couple of minutes as a part of our demo. Knife is a very nice to work with client for working with supermarket, although there are a couple of limitations. And first of them is that Knife can be configured to work with a single URL when it performs the operations. You can specify the URL for each and every command, which then you can of course use different URLs for different commands, but it's kind of tedious. There is a way to hard code the URL that your Knife is configured to work with, but then you need to select one. And if you set up multiple supermarkets or multiple repositories in Artifactory, the question is, how can you switch? How can you retrieve cookbooks from the chef supermarket cache from one side and deploy your own cookbooks into your local repository? And the answer is, Artifactory comes with the notion of virtual repository, which allows you to aggregate multiple repositories underneath. So we're going to get a single URL to a supermarket that actually have multiple repositories beneath it. Artifactory will take care of merging all the metadata together. So from the client perspective, from a Knife perspective, it will be just one supermarket with all the content that we need. And it's also backed by a local repository, which means that when we publish a cookbook into this virtual repository, it will get into the right local repository of our choice. So this is how we overcome this limitation of having a single URL in Knife configuration. And there is another a limitation which can be very easily overcome as well, is that Knife doesn't work with, out of the box, doesn't work with a username and password authentication method. So instead, we will use our own set of commands, which are implemented by installing Knife Artifactory plugin. It's just a single liner that installs this plugin, and then it allows a bunch of our own custom plugin commands. One of them is that now we can use the username and password authentication. And the other benefit is that we have simplified commands to work with Artifactory, stuff like install cookbooks and publish cookbooks. All that is simplified to work with Artifactory by using our plugins. So with that, let's get to a demo. So I'm going to share my screen here again. Okay, so it's looking good. I hope you see my screen. And so first of all, this is the Artifactory user guide. Go to just Google Artifactory user guide. You will get to this one. And there is a page dedicated to working with Chef Cookbook repositories. It has all the steps that we're going to do today, and of course much more. Also additional defaults. Additional details, nothing too complicated, but step-by-step instruction on how to work with it. And we're going to do the scenario that we spoke about. We're going first to proxy Chef Supermarket inside our Artifactory. So this is my Artifactory instance. As you can see, I run an Artifactory instance in a cloud, JFrog.io, and it works exactly the same for on-prem locally installed Artifactory instance as well. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a remote repository for a Chef Supermarket. That's the first thing that we are going to do. So creating a new repository is very easy. I select Chef here as a package type, and I will call it Chef Supermarket. And as you can see, the URL that this repository will cache automatically set to the right URL of supermarket.chef.io. I can test it to verify that everything is good, and actually our work here is done. Now we have Artifactory that knows how to cache Chef Supermarket. And next thing that we need to do is to set up Knife to work with that instead of working with the central supermarket. So we can go to our newly created repository and click on the Set Me Up button and get all the instructions of how to do it. And there is actually one line that we need to do, is to add this Knife supermarket site instruction into our knife.rb file. So we will copy that, and now we will just edit our knife.rb file. Here we go, it's an empty file, so we will add this line, we will save it, and our work here is done. So now we can try and run the Knife commands. So what we're going to do is we're going to install the official Chef client cookbook. Okay, we see the commands are running. The cookbook was downloaded. Some dependencies were downloaded as well. And looks like we're all set. Let's take a look in Artifactory to see what actually happened. We're going to refresh our Chef Supermarket cache. And as expected, the Chef client and all the dependencies are successfully installed. We have the Chef info tab here that we can see more details about our cookbook. You can see here information like the name, the version, maintainer, source URL, and all the rest. We also see the list of dependencies, and all those dependencies, as you can see, were successfully installed as well. So here is our cron dependency, and log rotate and Windows. All of them are right here. The list of the platforms, all the metadata about the chef info is right here. The properties is exactly the metadata that I spoke about, and you can see here that by default we fetch a lot of information about this cookbook from the metadata and expose them as Artifactory properties right here. And those properties can be used in this query language that we spoke about, together with your custom properties or with implicit file properties like size, number of downloads, etc., to construct any kind of query that uses all this metadata to provide you with exactly what you are looking for. So this is remote and it's all nice, but now let's create a local repository here and try to publish our own packages into it. So we will go and create a local repository here. Again, it will be chef. We will call it chef local. And actually, that's the only thing that we need to do. Our chef local is created, but the problem is now that we have to select what URL we want to expose in our knife configuration. Will it go to the supermarket, to the chef supermarket, or will it go to chef local? But as I already mentioned, we have this nice feature that can solve this problem, and that's a virtual repository. So getting back to the configuration, we'll create a new virtual repository, chef as well. We will just call it chef, and we will include both chef local and chef supermarket in it, and we will make sure that when we publish a cookbook, when we deploy a package, it will go into the chef local repository. Now we have a single URL that combines both of the cookbooks. So getting back to our browser, we can now go to the chef artifact repository, click on the set me up, and get the URL that actually takes care of both of them. So again, let's copy it and change the configuration of knife right here to be chef. Now it's all good, and we can try and publish our own package. So for that, now we can use the new Artifactory commands that made available for us after we installed our Artifactory plugin to knife. So let me show you the commands that are available for us, and here they are. Those will be the additions that Artifactory plugin adds to knife. You can see here stuff like knife Artifactory download, knife Artifactory install, and then there's the name of the cookbook, and there is a search here, and we will use knife Artifactory share to share our own new cookbook. First, let's create it. So I'll go into my cookbooks, and here I will create a new cookbook that is called My App. Okay, this is just the vanilla empty app, but it's good for our example, and we are going to publish this My App to our virtual repository, which in turn will deploy this cookbook into a local repository. So we will use the Artifactory command here, knife Artifactory share My App. We're going to try to share it, and it fails. It fails with the forbidden command because, of course, with the forbidden error, because of course while the read is allowed to everybody because It's our organizational supermarket, and we want to allow the developers to use these cookbooks without a need for username and password. The deployment is, of course, protected, and we got the forbidden error. So in order to overcome it, we need to incorporate user and password into our nice configuration, and this is done again from the Set Me Up button. So now we are going to type our password right here, and instead of just using the URL that goes into this virtual repository, we're going to use a URL that has my name and the generated API key that was generated based on my password. So again, I can just copy this line into a clipboard and paste it instead the simple URL. Now, that wasn't exactly what I need. What I need is that. So now I have my supermarket site authenticated with my username and an API key that actually a representation of my password. I save that and just retry the command. And now the upload is complete. It looks like it ended up without errors, and we can go to Artifactory and look what happened now. So this is our virtual repository, and here is our Chef local. Let's refresh it, and as you can see here, my app was successfully deployed, and of course now it can be used from the same URL that we used the supermarket cache. So getting back to the virtual here, we can see that it includes both repositories here, the local and the supermarket, and going here to sorry about that here, and going here to this URL will actually show us the view of everything we have both in my local supermarket and in the cache of my remote supermarket, the general Chef supermarket. So you can see here that both Chef client that we installed from the cache and my app that we just deployed from my machine are here, and this is the entry point for both repositories inside the virtual repository. So I think that concludes the demo. And now we have plenty of time, about 20 minutes, for your questions.
Great, thanks so much for the demo and the presentation, Baruch. And it's Julian Dunn again. I'm going to go through some of the Q&A, some of the questions that we got here. The most popular one, we got a few questions around how to manage dependencies between cookbooks. Just read one. Dependencies can be built, for example, within the system itself. How does this solution help in this case?
So that's exactly, that works exactly the same way as any other dependency which is published into supermarket, and the solution, of course, will be publishing the dependencies as well. And as I showed in an example of the official Chef client that comes with a bunch of dependencies that all come from the central supermarket, it works exactly the same for your own dependencies that you publish to your own supermarket, to this local repository. And in a lot of cases, you will have mixed set of dependencies. Some of them are your local, and some of them that actually come from another developers and other contributors, and are part of the Chef supermarket. And by using virtual repository, it will be able to resolve both of them. So there is no problem at all in using mix of the dependencies, your own and external, as long as they are all published in some repository in Artifactory. And then everything will just work as expected. So my app was very simple and didn't have any dependencies, but it definitely could depend on other cookbooks and then it would just work in the same way.
Great. Let's move to another question, which is, to use Chef with Artifactory, do we need to have a Chef server, or can we use Solo or Zero?
So Artifactory by itself is a Chef server, right? So once one of the big advantages in that is that you don't need to set up additional Chef server in your organization in order to serve the cookbooks from it. When you use a knife with Artifactory, you get your cookbooks downloaded locally, and then you just work with them as it works Chef Solo.
Great. Let's go to another one. If I have looks like this customer has a virtual Chef repo that contains both a local Chef repo and a remote. They're using Burkshelf to manage the cookbooks right now. When they try to vendor cookbooks, we see a timeout on the indexing of the cookbooks on the request of the universe. Any advice there?
So there is some quiet period between the calculation of the metadata, and that's just because we wait until the deployment of multiple different cookbooks are completed before calculating and merging metadata. If there is a timeout which is not reasonable in terms of how long we should wait until the metadata is calculated, there is a property in the advanced configuration of the virtual repository that controls how frequently the metadata is checked and calculated. That can definitely be a solution. If that doesn't work, I guess it's worth writing a note to our support, and we will look into it. Maybe there is some other misconfiguration that is done.
Great. Thanks. Let's see. Is it possible to have multiple local repositories and one virtual repository?
Oh yes, absolutely. It's actually a very good idea to have multiple local repositories, because if you remember this diagram that I showed in the beginning of the promotion pipeline with all those quality gates, that stands for Chef cookbooks as well, of course. You definitely want to have different local repositories with different visibility. It can be based on the quality of those cookbooks. There is some in development quality and some in staging quality and in production quality. That definitely should go into different local repositories, but also we see a lot of other use cases in which different local repositories make a lot of sense. Stuff like per project. Every project want to have their own set of local repositories, etc., etc. So it's definitely a very valid use case to have multiple local repositories. When you aggregate them under a single virtual repository, of course, the resolution will be unified, but when we are talking about deployment, one of those local repositories need to be selected as the default local repository to which the artifacts will be deployed when they are sent into this virtual repository. For the obvious reasons, you can have only one target repository for your artifacts to go to. I hope that makes sense. It doesn't mean that you cannot deploy into local repository directly. Of course you can, but if you want to deploy through virtual repository, you need to select one local repository that this virtual repository is back to in terms of deployment. Resolution will work with as many local repositories as needed under a single virtual.
Great. How do you respond to the problem that the Artifactory plugin for Knife doesn't currently prevent the overwriting of existing uploads?
That's actually not a problem, because it is taken care of in a level of Artifactory permissions. So Artifactory have a very rich permission model, which is targeted towards a binary files management. And one of the rules in binary file management is that you can never, or you shouldn't, override binary files. because they're versioned not by their content, but by their name. And if you deploy the file under a certain name, it shouldn't be deleted. If you have a new version, it will have a different file name and it will reside by it. So override permission in Artifactory is a very, I would say, kind of administrative permission that shouldn't be granted a lot. It has its separate entry, and all you need to do in order to prevent overriding of the packages through Knife or any other client is to specify the right permissions on the repository. And most of the times you won't allow override of the files on the permission, on the repository level, and trying to override the files using Knife commands will end up with server-side error, which basically means you don't have permission to override.
Great. Let's see. Wow, we have a lot of questions. Great. Let's see. Does this new plugin work also with Bookshelf? And I can answer, yes, it does.
Yeah, so the plugin itself works with, I would say, the official guidelines are with Knife. We are looking into expand it to different clients as well, but me personally, I am not sure we can guarantee that it works with Bookshelf in the same way.
Gotcha. Okay, is there any need to specify a different supermarket URL in the Brooks file?
Well, so again, you don't need to, just because virtual repositories allow you to use the single URL to approach all the supermarkets inside Artifactory, right? And both for read and deploy. So here we are in a better way. I have a question for you, Julian, because I'm not very familiar with Bookshelf. Does it allow multiple marketplace URLs in the configuration?
I'm not sure about that. I think you can specify multiple sources. I think one of the things that we have been talking about in the community is actually being able to add Artifactory perhaps as a first-class citizen within the Brooks file, right? So right now, instead of saying, the way you need to do it is you need to say, the supermarket URL is basically pointing to Artifactory, and maybe in the future we can just say that says Artifactory, and that you could also use the public supermarket at the same time. So you have a completely different source instead of just mixing and matching the sources as we do now.
Oh, okay. So if it does support multiple sources, and here I can see that our listeners actually confirm that, then of course you can specify multiple Artifactory URLs directly in Bookshelf and say, here is my local repository for one project, and here is another local repository for another project, and those will be the sources that I deploy to. And for resolution, here is a one entry point, which is a virtual repository that aggregates all of that. That's actually the best practices that are used in Artifactory with other package managers, being it both other configuration tools or development tools or what's not. And Artifactory have this flexibility of supporting both a single URL as in Knife and multiple URLs as in Bookshelf. Both work. You just select whatever practice fits more. I would generally advocate to have as less URLs as possible, just because it simplifies the configuration, but it's definitely up to the maintainers to decide how many and which URLs make sense for them.
Right. Another question from Anwar. Can you use service accounts instead of your username and password?
Yes, absolutely. So Artifactory supports a wide range of organizational tools for access control, LDAP, Active Directory, OAuth, and what's not. and you will just get your username and the API key directly from your organization tools instead of using Artifactory user server, and it will actually do the exact same way.
Great.
And there is, Julian, I see a lot of questions about something that I said, and I think I want to clarify that a little bit. And that when I said that you don't need to run another Chef server with alongside Artifactory, well, I actually meant is that you don't need to run a Chef server for provisioning the cookbooks. Now, of course, Chef server does much more. Like managing nodes, managing agents, Chef environments, etc., etc. All that is not covered inside Artifactory. So it's definitely for everything else except of provisioning Chef cookbooks, you will need a fully fledged Chef server installed somewhere in your environment. Just to make it clear.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful point of clarification, Baruch, because I think some folks thought that it could manage nodes and things like that as well.
Yeah, so no, it's just a server of serving the cookbooks, yes.
Yeah, right. Let's see, yeah, there's a bunch of questions around that. Interesting question. Are you aware of any bugs or defects in the current version pertinent to this particular integration?
Well, so the repositories work, from what we know, the repositories work fine. I don't think we have any open issues against it. The plugin, we work on adding additional functionality, but again, as of bugs, I'm not aware of any open bugs that are there. If you encounter something that looks like a bug, by all means, please send it to our support team. We will verify and fix it as soon as possible. So, you know, it's software. There are probably some bugs lurking out there, not that we currently aware of any major ones.
Great. Thanks. Let's see. What disk space do you recommend for an Artifactory server?
So it really depends on your usage, and it goes from all the way from a Raspberry Pi, which is one extreme, or just your commodity server, which is a normal usage, to huge servers like Exalogic and Exadata on the really insane side of things. So it really depends on your usage, and the disk space actually correlates to the number of artifacts you store in your Artifactory server. We do a binary deduplication, so if you deploy the same file multiple times, it will be saved only once, so you can gain some space there. But as a rule of thumb, whatever you put in Artifactory, this is how much space it will take. Julian?
Oh, I'm sorry, I was muted. As we can maintain privileged access management in Chef Server, is there the same way to do that in Artifactory, so that you can prevent, let's say, developers from being granted access to cookbooks which are not owned by them?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think I already mentioned we have all the permission model implemented in Artifactory on the repository level and on any deeps of sub-repositories, so you can cut and slice the repository access in a way that makes sense to you. We support users and groups, both created internally in Artifactory user management and also externally in LDAP or Active Directory or OAuth, and then you can add those developers to different groups and provide them with read access or deploy access adding metadata as a separate permission, and of course stuff like delete and override that you, as I mentioned, you shouldn't allow much, but of course it's a permission by its own. And there are different management level permissions. You can be an admin of course all Artifactory server, or just a subset of repositories, or a place inside the repository itself. So you can specify it in the way that that you feel right. And I see here a follow-up question about the permissions at the repository level and not a cookbook level. Well, that's of course configurable. The permission target can be starting from a repository, or I would say a group of repositories, all the way to a certain file inside Artifactory. So you can go deep inside a repository and add permissions on the cookbook level as well.
Great. I think that's all the questions that we have received, or there's a number of other questions around setting it up and things like this, and all that information is covered in the documentation that we will be sending as a follow-up link to the attendees. So I'd like to thank Baruch very much for this presentation and the very compelling demo and talking about the features and our continuing partnership with JFrog. So
thank you very much for having me, Julian. It was a great pleasure to be here with you today.
Thanks. And back to you, Jamie.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Julian and Baruch, for all the great information. As a reminder, a copy of today's slide deck and additional help materials are available in the resource list widget at the bottom of your screen, and we encourage you to download any resources or bookmark any links that you may find useful. And thank you to our audience for your live participation today. We, of course, hope you found value in the information that was presented. And if you like what you saw, we encourage you to share the recorded presentation with your teammates or professional networks. The on-demand version should be available by tomorrow. Thanks again for your time, and have a wonderful day.